Welcome to this explainer. You know, if you're a parent, there are very few things more painful, or honestly more frustrating, than sitting across a desk in one of those fluorescent lit school offices, knowing deep down in your gut that your child is struggling, only to hear the words, "they do not qualify for help." You've probably spent months being handed off between teachers, specialists, and administrators. You've had to learn how to translate a phrase like, "we will monitor," into what it usually really means. Nothing is going to happen. And all the while, you're just watching your child's spark slowly dim in a classroom that seems designed for someone else entirely. So in this explainer, we're going to take a really close look at the special education gap right here in Sacramento. We're going to unpack the absolute crucial reality that not qualifying for an IEP absolutely does not mean your child is fine. Because, think about it. When you walked into that IEP meeting, you had a very specific question pressing heavily on your heart. Is something going on with how my child learns? You aren't just guessing here. You know your kid better than anyone on the planet. You see the late-night tears, the sudden avoidance of reading, the sheer exhaustion after a normal school day. You brought a clinical, deeply personal question to that table, really hoping for an answer about how your child's brain processes information. I want to validate that intuition for you right now. Your question was absolutely the right one to ask. But here is the crucial reality we have to talk about. Does not qualify is simply not a diagnosis. When the school told you your child didn't qualify, they actually weren't answering the question you asked. They were answering a totally different, strictly legal question. Is this district legally required to fund special education services for this student under California's rules? Parents walk out of these meetings every single day thinking they just received a clean bill of health. But nobody at the table stops to explain that what you actually just received was a funding decision. So there's this massive, fundamental gap between these two worlds. A school evaluation, it's pretty narrow, and it's highly procedural. It is built purely to determine if a child meets a specific legal threshold for services. It's a simple yes or no checklist based on state funding criteria. It does not diagnose, and it certainly does not explain why your child is struggling. A private assessment, on the other hand, provides an actual clinical diagnosis. It uncovers the specific processing differences, like dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia, and it creates a highly actionable intervention plan. In that meeting room, two completely different conversations were happening, and you were only part of one of them.
Now you might be wondering, how exactly do schools in Sacramento area districts like San Juan, Elk Grove, Sacramento City Unified, or Natomas actually make these funding decisions? Well, historically, they have relied heavily on a framework called the discrepancy model. Essentially, this means the school is looking for a severe gap between what a student's intelligence says they should be able to do and what they are actually producing in class. If that gap isn't wide enough on their charts, the student doesn't qualify. And while some districts also use a response to intervention approach, the discrepancy model is still heavily leaned upon. And it is important to understand that this isn't out of malice at all. The districts are simply applying the standard state frameworks they've been given.
But here is where the whole thing becomes incredibly heartbreaking. It's what we call the bright student trap. See, a really smart child who has a learning difference will naturally compensate, often without even realizing they're doing it. They'll memorize whole words by shape instead of actually decoding them. They use context clues to guess what comes next. At school, they look like a typical B- student who maybe just reads a little slowly. But at home, it is a completely different story. The very same child is melting down, crying at the kitchen table over a simple worksheet that should have taken 20 minutes max. So why does this happen? Well, it's actually because their ability is the very thing covering for them. These really bright kids are out there working harder than anyone else in the room. And because they are so smart, their performance just never drops quite far enough below their ability to trigger that school discrepancy model. They land in this painful, frustrating gray zone where they are struggling way too much to thrive, but unfortunately not failing badly enough to qualify for help. Listen, I want you to hear this loud and clear. That is not a flaw in your child. It is a flaw in tools built only to catch obvious massive drops in data.
Section 1. Accommodation versus remediation. So what happens after that first no? Usually, families push back and eventually come away with a 504 plan. And let me say, getting a 504 plan is a genuine win, and these supports are completely legitimate. Things like extended time on tests, audiobooks, preferential seating, or using a calculator, these provide completely necessary workarounds for classroom survival. They make the daily school grind easier. But we do have to be completely honest about what they actually are. They are management tools.
Because the reality is, a 504 plan helps your child survive the day. It does not teach the brain to read.
Accommodations, while helpful, leave the underlying processing issue totally untouched. Giving a child more time does not magically teach them how to decode words. A calculator does not build foundational number sense. The very day you sign that 504 plan, the actual processing challenge happening inside your child's head, it's still exactly the same. It works for a while, sure, but usually right around 4th or 5th grade when the schoolwork suddenly gets much harder, all those coping strategies just collapse.
What actually moves the needle is remediation. This is explicit, systematic, evidence-based instruction that literally teaches the brain to do the thing it's been working around. We're talking about intensive programs here, like Orton Gillingham, the Wilson Reading System, or Making Math Real. These don't just help a child scrape through tonight's homework, they build the very foundation the homework sits on. And honestly, this is exactly why hiring a standard tutor so often fails. A standard tutor focuses on output, finishing a worksheet, or prepping for Friday's test. But for a child with a learning difference, the problem is input. Think of it like hiring a world-class running coach for someone with a broken foot. No matter how amazing that coaching is, the fracture is still there. You have to fix the input.
Section 2. Rights you aren't told. Now, I really want to empower you here. When the school says your child does not qualify, there is actually a whole list of procedural safeguards written into federal and state law that, let's face it, almost nobody reads cover to cover in those thick school packets. These are your rights, and it's time you know them. Let's walk through these 5 hidden rights really quickly. First, under federal IDEA law, if you disagree with the school's evaluation, you can request an independent educational evaluation, an IEE, at the district's expense. Second, the district must consider any outside evaluations you bring to them. They don't have to agree with it, but legally they absolutely must put it on the table. Third, you can ask for a new evaluation if something changes, like a widening academic gap or a brand new clinical diagnosis. Fourth, you have every right to bring an educational advocate or clinician right into that IEP meeting with you. Believe me, who is in that room changes the dynamic completely. And fifth, does not qualify is never permanent. As academic demands increase, a child who didn't quite qualify in 2nd grade might very well qualify by 4th.
Section 3. Your crucial next move.
To actually trigger those rights we just talked about, you need leverage. You need something the school cannot simply wave off, and that is independent clinical data. So what do you do next? Here is the exact actionable sequence to get a real answer. Step 1. Get an independent, comprehensive dyslexia assessment done completely outside the school system. Step 2. Use that hard clinical data to go right back to the district. And step 3. Start evidence-based remediation at Reed Learning Center. This is exactly how you reclaim the narrative. You take clinical findings and actionable intervention plans straight back to that IEP team.
Now, what does this comprehensive assessment actually entail? Well, at Reed Learning Center, every single assessment is conducted personally by a certified dyslexia therapist, someone with over 22 years of clinical experience in this exact field. Over a highly streamlined 1 to 2 week process, we dive deep. We review your child's developmental and educational history, conduct a full battery of standardized testing, and identify exactly where things are breaking down, whether that ends up being dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia. Interestingly enough, many times an undiagnosed dyslexia is actually found hiding right underneath ADHD symptoms. You leave this process with a crystal clear picture and, more importantly, a clear next step.
And here is a really great piece of practical news for families navigating the Sacramento area homeschool charters. There is some very real funding relief available. If your child happens to be enrolled in Pacific Charter Institute, Horizon Charter Schools, or the Cottonwood School, Reed Learning Center is an approved vendor. These programs typically allocate between $2,600 to $3,400 per year in instructional funds, which can often be applied directly toward these assessments and tutoring services. That is a huge help for families ready to take action. I want to leave you with this one vital thought. Your child is bright. The system simply missed them. And that is a perfectly fixable problem. You know, the longer a struggling child sits in class without the right help, the more they start to quietly believe that they just aren't smart. And a child cannot tell the difference between what is actually true and what they have to endure every single day. But you do not have to just wait on the school. You are absolutely allowed to demand better answers than the ones you got. Armed with the right clinical data, how quickly will you reclaim your child's confidence and finally get them the remediation they truly deserve?